This is a journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Louisiana's history. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you are and what time it is when you are listening to this narration. We want to know where these written accounts go and when they reach those places. The bayous in Street Mary Parish never give up all of their secrets. In 1881, a trapper who was going through the murky waters near Morgan City found something that official records wouldn't explain for almost 8 decades. What started as a simple report of abandoned property turned into one of Louisiana's most disturbing unsolved cases, which local authorities seem determined to forget. According to records from the Morgan City Clerk's office that are still around, dated the 18th of February, 1881, a local fur trapper named August Thibodeau said he found a cabin by itself about 4 miles into the cypress swamps south of Bayou Boeuf. At first, he was drawn to the structure itself. But what really caught his eye was how carefully the objects around it were arranged. They were placed so that they lined up perfectly with the cardinal directions, which made it seem like they were there on purpose rather than by chance. 3 days later, the Morgan City Sheriff's report said that the abandoned property belonged to brothers Elijah and Thomas Blackwood. The report says in a clinical tone, "Dwelling found vacant, no signs of struggle or disturbance. Property appears to have been deliberately arranged prior to departure." The brothers, who had moved to Virginia about 7 years earlier, seemed to have disappeared without a trace. The official report didn't say anything about how disturbing the things arranged around the property were, but Deputy Marshal James Lavo's personal journal later revealed this. Lavo wrote, "Specimen jars with preserved animal parts, dates, and locations, all facing north. The arrangement makes a perfect circle around the property line, about 40 yards in diameter." The journal entry goes on to say something that was purposely left out of official records. Sheriff Beauregard said that the specimens should not be mentioned in public records. When I asked why, he only said that some things are better left alone. The jars were to be taken away and destroyed without being counted. It's not clear if this destruction really happened. There is no record of what happened to the specimens after they were thrown away, and Deputy Lavo's later journal entries suggest he wasn't sure what happened to them. He wrote on the 12th of March, 1881, "I went back to the evidence room and found that the specimens from the Blackwood property were missing. When I asked the clerk about them, he said he had never seen them logged into evidence. Everyone says that the Blackwood brothers stayed to themselves after they got to Louisiana in 1874. The Street Mary Parish Courthouse has land records that show they bought 20 acres of swampland with money they got from a family inheritance. At 32, Thomas was the oldest and the main owner of the property. Elijah, who is 28, was named as a co-owner. They were the only family members who went with them. The deed of sale says that the property was bought from a Creole landowner named Marcel DeVoe, who is said to have sold it for a lot less than it was worth. Adeline Hibber, a shopkeeper in Morgan City, kept a journal that included local gossip that suggests DeVoe wanted to get rid of the land. She wrote, "Mr. DeVoe seemed happy to be rid of that piece of land. When asked about the generous terms, he said that some land is more trouble than it's worth. The next day, he left for New Orleans and hasn't come back." The Morgan City Review, the local newspaper, only wrote about the brothers twice during the 7 years they lived in the area. The first mention was a short note about their arrival. "Two educated and wealthy men from Virginia have moved to the parish. The Blackwood brothers, Thomas and Elijah, are interested in natural philosophy and the native plants of our area." The second mention was 3 years later, in 1877, when Thomas Blackwood gave the new parish library a collection of pressed plants. The article said that he was quiet but friendly and knew a lot about plant taxonomy. The article didn't say anything about how some of the specimens were unusual, but a private letter from the librarian to her sister in Baton Rouge did. Most of Mr. Blackwood's contributions were normal examples of local plant life, she wrote. However, some specimens had strange features, hybrid formations that our reference texts can't identify. When asked about these oddities, Mr. Blackwood said they were adaptive responses to certain environmental conditions that he and his brother were documenting. People who lived nearby gave different stories about the brothers. Marie Fontenot, who lived the closest to the Blackwoods, almost 2 miles away, said they were nice gentlemen who kept their distance, but were never rude. She said that Thomas would sometimes come to town to get supplies, but she rarely saw Elijah. Fontenot said in a statement recorded by the sheriff's office after the brothers went missing, Thomas would come for supplies every 2 weeks or so. He was always polite and paid in cash. He spoke with an educated accent, but never talked about their work directly. When asked, he would say only that they were documenting regional variations. Elijah, the first, saw perhaps 3 times in all those years. He seemed uncomfortable around others, not hostile, but watchful. His hands were always stained with something dark that wasn't quite mud. Jean Mouton, a trapper who sometimes traveled the waterways near their property, had a different, more disturbing impression. The younger one, he watched from the trees, never speaking, just observing, like he was studying something, not hunting, not fishing, just watching. Mouton's statement, recorded in the same investigation, continued. Sometimes I would hear sounds from their property, not voices exactly, more like humming, rhythmic, like someone reciting something over and over. And sometimes at night, lights moved through the trees in patterns, not lanterns carried by men. Something else, something that moved too regular to be natural, too irregular to be human. Tax records show that the brothers paid their property taxes on time every year until 1880, when there was no record of a payment. It wasn't until February 1881 that their absence was officially noted. The first investigation was very brief at best. Sheriff's deputies said the cabin was in perfect condition, with made beds, clean dishes, and pantries full of preserved foods. There was no sign of violence or a quick exit. The only strange things that were noted in official records were a lot of written materials and scientific tools whose purpose was not clear. What happened next shows either a huge failure of official procedure or an intentional effort to hide the results. Deputy Lavo called the written materials journals, correspondence, and research notes. They were gathered but never officially counted. The sheriff's office took the scientific tools away, but they later vanished from the evidence logs. Lavo's personal journal, which has been more reliable than official records, says, "The papers were written in a code that no one in our office could figure out." The sheriff ordered them locked in his private cabinet. The tools included devices for measuring tiny differences in organic structures, calipers of unusual precision, microscopes made in other countries, and tools that I don't know the name of. The investigation was over in 2 weeks. The official conclusion was that the Blackwood brothers had probably gone back to Virginia or moved somewhere else to finish their studies. The county held the property in trust for the required 7 years before putting it up for auction in 1888. There are no travel records at all, which makes this quick conclusion even more puzzling. There is no record of the brothers leaving on a steamboat or a train. There was no communication with family members in Virginia that showed they were coming back. They just disappeared, leaving behind a fully furnished house and expensive scientific tools. A detail in Lavo's journal that wasn't included in official reports is even more troubling. During our last inspection of the property, he wrote, "We found a crawl space under the cabin floor. There was only one wooden chair in the space, facing a blank wall. On the wall, drawn in what looked like a dark pigment, was a circular pattern of connected symbols. The sheriff ordered the crawl space sealed without any paperwork. When I asked what the room was for, he said, 'Some questions are safer left unasked.' If it weren't for Professor Harlan Winters of Tulane University being curious about the case, it might have stayed closed and forgotten in dusty archives." Winters found a mention of the Blackwood brothers in a footnote of a regional botanical survey from 1879, while doing research for his doctoral thesis on pre-industrial scientific practices in Louisiana in 1956. The footnote talked about how independent researchers T. made important contributions to our understanding of the taxonomy of riparian flora, and E. Blackwood, and referred to an article that was published in a scientific journal that is no longer in print. Winters, who was interested in these independent researchers working in remote Louisiana, started to look into their past. The article, which was published in the little-known Proceedings of the Southern Association for Natural Philosophy, talked about how the brothers saw plants changing quickly in response to certain soil conditions. The paper was very important for its time because it showed that environmental factors could cause plants to change quickly, which was the first step toward what we now call epigenetic adaptation. The article's assertion that these adaptations adhered to a predictable developmental pattern which could be intentionally induced under controlled circumstances was particularly unusual. Winters thought the results were important enough that he wondered why this research hadn't gotten more attention. What he found out is the basis for what we know about the case today. Winters slowly put together pieces of the Blackwood brothers' story by writing to historical societies, university archives, and government repositories over and over again. These pieces hinted at something much more disturbing than abandoned property in the bayou. Records from the University of Virginia show that Thomas Blackwood did study natural philosophy and chemistry in the early 1872. His academic record was outstanding, although several professors remarked on his peculiar fixation with the categorization of anomalies and an inordinate fascination with developmental irregularities in natural specimens. In a letter of recommendation from his main advisor, Dr. William Hammond, there was an interesting line. Mr. Blackwood's intellect is unquestionable, as is his dedication to methodical research. However, I must note his tendency to pursue unconventional hypotheses regarding biological development that fall outside mainstream scientific consensus. While this independent thinking may serve him well in certain contexts, it has created tension with faculty members committed to established taxonomic principles. It was harder to find out about Elijah's past. There were no records from the university, but letters between the brothers that were found in the archives of their old family home in Albemarle County, Virginia, suggested that he knew a lot about anatomy and may have studied medicine on his own. In a letter from Thomas to Elijah, dated 1871, Thomas says, "Your observations about the progressions in the rabbit specimens are amazing. The university faculty would dismiss them as aberrations or monstrosities, but your systematic documentation proves otherwise. We are seeing not random deviations, but a coherent pattern of development that conventional taxonomy refuses to acknowledge." The most telling thing Winters found was a letter from Thomas to a former professor at the University of Virginia that was written in 1873. Thomas explained their plans to move. "We seek isolation, not from misanthropy, but from necessity. Our research requires both privacy and specific environmental conditions, found only in certain wetland ecosystems. The abundance of biological diversity in the southern Louisiana terrain offers unprecedented opportunities for our classification system. Elijah believes, and I concur, that the patterns will emerge more clearly once sufficient specimens have been processed and cataloged according to our method." The letter goes on to say something scary that might explain why they went missing. We have received another letter from Baltimore. They continue to misunderstand our purpose, interpreting our rejection of their assumptions as academic rivalry rather than methodological necessity. I fear they may take more direct action to acquire our research. We have taken precautions. Winters' investigation showed that the brothers had written to researchers at the University of Baltimore's Department of Comparative Anatomy between 1874 and 1880. The early conversations seemed friendly and were about how to classify biological specimens in taxonomic systems. The tone, on the other hand, changed a lot after the Blackwoods article came out in 1879. In a letter from Dr. Edmund Carrington, the department chair, dated June 1879, he said, "Your published findings about accelerated adaptive mutations raise serious concerns. The mechanisms you propose go against what is already known about biological development. Even more worrying is your suggestion that these changes follow a predictable pattern that can be deliberately induced. I strongly urge you to submit your specimens and methodology for peer review before going any further." The Blackwoods answer, which is still in Carrington's files, was diplomatically vague. "We appreciate your interest in our research. However, our classification system is still being developed, and too much attention too soon could lead to misunderstandings. When our documentation is complete, we will be happy to share our findings with the scientific community." If Professor Winters hadn't found a key link through property records, his investigation might have ended there with interesting but inconclusive historical facts. Archibald Hebert bought the land that was auctioned off after the Blackwoods went missing and kept it until his death in 1924. Hebert's granddaughter, who lived in Morgan City in 1956, had a box of things that were found buried on the property when a hunting cabin was built there in 1932. One of these things was a waterproof tin box with a journal inside that belonged to Elijah Blackwood and recorded his thoughts from 1,877 to 1,880. There are no personal thoughts in the journal, just detailed records of specimens, variations, and developmental progressions. Most of the entries are written in a clinical style, with dates, places, measurements, and things that were seen. A typical entry says, Specimen Series 17, Variation D. After 14 days in prepared medium, the third stage of progression was reached. The structural changes were in line with what was expected. The neural development was 17% higher than the baseline. The motility was limited but present. The specimen was moved to an isolation chamber for further observation. Another entry, which is even more cryptic, says, the pattern repeats across taxonomic boundaries. What we saw in plants is now confirmed in animals. T suggests a unified developmental framework, a meta-taxonomy, that goes beyond traditional classification systems. The implications are profound. But the last entries get more and more angry. The most recent entry, from November 1880, says, T insists we have proven the hypothesis sufficiently. I disagree. The pattern remains incomplete. Without the final classifications, the progression cannot be demonstrated conclusively. The Baltimore correspondents arrived yesterday. They know more than they should. T has begun preparations for relocation. I have secured the peripheral arrangements as a precaution. If our work is to be interrupted, it will at least be preserved in situ. Winters couldn't read the encoded notes in the journal, which took up several pages. What bothered me more were the pressed plant specimens scattered throughout the journal. The plants had strange structural changes that botanist Winters talked to could not identify as known species or recognized mutations. There was also a hand-drawn map of the property in the tin container. It showed the exact places where things that looked like they were buried were arranged in a geometric pattern around the cabin. There was a symbol at each location that matched an entry in the journal. In 1957, Professor Winters published his first results in the Journal of Southern Historical Research. His article, Scientific Practices and Social Isolation, The Curious Case of the Blackwood Brothers, gave a cleaned-up version of his findings, saying that the brothers were strange but real researchers who probably died because of academic competition or maybe disease. People's reactions to Winters' book were unexpected. 3 weeks after it came out, he got a letter on University of Baltimore letterhead. The short, unsigned letter said only, Inquiry terminated. 1,881. Record sealed by order of department. No further investigation advised. In early 1958, Winters, who had a long history of being persistent in school, went to Baltimore. There was no record in the university archives of any department being interested in the Blackwood brothers. But a librarian told him to look in the historical medical collections, where he found a thin file that said Louisiana Correspondence 1,874, 1,881. The file had copies of letters that Dr. Edmund Carrington, who was then the chair of the Department of Comparative Anatomy, sent to the Blackwood brothers. At first, the letters were friendly conversations about how to classify anatomical variations, but they quickly turned into fights. A letter from September 1879 says, Your refusal to submit specimens for verification undermines scientific methodology. If your classification system truly represents a paradigm shift in understanding biological development, it must withstand peer examination. Your secrecy suggests either unfounded claims or methods that would not survive ethical scrutiny. The last letter, dated January 1881, made it clear that it was a threat. Your continued experiments are a dangerous departure from accepted scientific and ethical practices. Your refusal to allow departmental oversight cannot continue. I have spoken with colleagues at Johns Hopkins who share my concerns. A delegation will arrive to review your work directly. Specimens and documentation will be secured for proper evaluation. This letter was written about 6 weeks before the discovery of the abandoned Blackwood property. What bothered Winters the most was a handwritten note that had been added to this last letter after it had been sent. The note, written by Carrington, said, "Expedition left on the 17th of January 1881. No communication received." Second expedition sent on February 25 after a telegraph from Louisiana authorities about abandoned property. Returned on March 18. Report, sealed by departmental order. There was no record of either expedition's findings in the accessible archives. When Winters asked about these reports, he was told that some historical medical records were off limits because of university policy. This was because there were ethical concerns about using old research methods. Even though Baltimore told him to stop, Winters kept looking into it. In June 1958, he got the go-ahead to do an archaeological survey of the old Blackwood property, which is now mostly swamp. No official publication has ever fully recorded what he found there. The team found a series of clay pots buried at regular intervals around the property's edge, according to field notes found among Winters's belongings after his death. Each container held preserved organic matter and extensive annotations inscribed in a cipher. Partial decryption indicated that the contents were organized according to a systematic sequence of anatomical development or variation. One vessel, which broke during the excavation, had what looked like a preserved specimen of an unknown origin. Winters' notes say that it has traits of more than one taxonomic classification at the same time, as if it were a transitional form between established categories. The field photographer said he couldn't take pictures of the specimen because his equipment broke down when he was near it. The most disturbing thing was finding a sealed chamber made of cypress and pitch under the old cabin site. There were hundreds of specimen jars in the room, but they were arranged on shelves in a way that no one knew how to do it. At this point, Winters' notes start to get broken up, with mentions of impossible developmental sequences and taxonomic contradictions. He wrote, "The specimens seem to follow a progressive sequence, starting with recognizable flora and fauna, and slowly moving to forms that don't fit into any known category." This progression suggests not random mutation, but directed development along a predetermined pattern, as if the brothers had found a basic template for biological evolution that could be sped up and guided under certain conditions. Another entry says, "The later specimens show traits that should be taxonomically impossible, structural changes that cross species lines." What's even more troubling is the apparent timeline. The dates show an accelerating progression, with each stage reached faster than the last. The last specimens, dated November 1880, show a convergence of traits that suggests the brothers were getting close to some kind of conclusion in their work. The last entry in Winters' field journal, which was written on the 17th of June 1958, says, "The B brothers were right about the pattern. It was there all along. A fire destroyed the excavation site and all the materials that had been found 3 days later. The official report said that lightning was most likely to blame, but the archaeological team said that the weather was clear the whole time they were there." A team member who spoke to a local newspaper on the condition of anonymity said, "It started at multiple points around the perimeter at the same time, exactly where we had dug up the buried vessels. The flames were strange. They moved against the wind and came together at the central site instead of spreading out. By morning, there was nothing left but ash." Shortly after that, Professor Winters stopped his research, quit his job at Tulane, and moved to Vermont. He didn't write anything else about the Blackwood brothers, and when other researchers tried to talk to him about it, he reportedly refused. He passed away in 1966 and left his papers to the university with the order that some files stay sealed until 1990. A coworker who saw Winters shortly before he died later told the story of their conversation. Harlan was a different person, jumpy and paranoid. He kept the curtains drawn and spoke in whispers. When I asked him directly about the Blackwood case, he said, "Only some patterns, once recognized, cannot be unseen. Some knowledge changes the observer." He wouldn't say anything more. Researchers found that all of the information about the Blackwood case had been taken out of Winters's sealed files when they were finally opened in 1990. There was only one note in Winters' handwriting that said, "Some patterns should remain unrecognized." There was also a small envelope with what looked like strange-looking plant seeds inside it. They were found to be non-viable in the lab, but their DNA had sequences that didn't match any known plant species. The report said, "Genetic structure suggests deliberate modification rather than natural mutation." Since then, the seeds and their analysis have been removed from university records. People might have lost interest in the case after that, only bringing it up now and then in collections of Louisiana mysteries from the past. But the University of Baltimore's medical archives were being renovated. In 1962, while cataloging 19th-century specimens, archivists found a sealed crate with the words "Louisiana Materials, secured by Carrington Expedition, 1881" written on it. University policy said that the crate had to be opened and its contents counted. The chief archivist's one-page report said that the crate held preserved biological specimens of unknown origin, arranged in a progressive sequence, along with encoded documentation. The report says that Dr. Harold Mercer, who was then the chair of the Department of Anatomy, looked at the contents and told them to be resealed and put in a locked storage area right away. Dorothy Jenkins, the archivist who first found the crate, later told a co-worker, "I only saw the contents briefly before Dr. Mercer arrived, but what I saw was beyond explanation. The specimens looked like organic material preserved in solution, but their structures didn't fit into any taxonomic category I knew. They seemed to bridge classifications, plant-like tissues with neural structures, invertebrate morphology with vertebrate characteristics. What was most disturbing was the way they were arranged, in a sequence that seemed to show a progression towards some end. There are no more official mentions of these materials in university records. Dr. Mercer's personal letters, which were given to the university archives after his death in 1968, include a letter to a colleague at Johns Hopkins that gives a disturbing glimpse. The Blackwood materials defy conventional explanation. The specimens themselves appear authentically biological, yet the developmental progression they suggest contradicts our most basic understanding of taxonomy. More troubling is the methodical documentation, which suggests years of systematic work rather than isolated anomalies. If their classification system proves viable, the implications for our understanding of biological development would be profound and disturbing. I have ordered the materials sealed, not from scientific conservatism, but from genuine concern about their potential applications. A letter that came 2 weeks later says, "After looking more closely at the encoded notes that came with the specimens, I am more and more convinced that the Blackwoods had found what could be called a meta-pattern in biological development, a template that goes beyond traditional taxonomic boundaries. Their research suggests that this pattern can be deliberately sped up in certain situations, leading to developmental changes that seem to go against established evolutionary principles. The moral implications are huge." The last letter in the series, written just before the materials were resealed, has a passage that hints at why both university and local authorities might have tried to stop the Blackwoods research. The most troubling aspect is not what the brothers discovered, but what they appeared to be attempting. The sequential arrangement of specimens, combined with their encoded notes, suggests they were working towards some culmination, a final stage in their directed progression that would represent a convergence of characteristics across taxonomic boundaries. The implications are too disturbing to articulate explicitly in writing. No one knows where these materials are now. Officials at the University of Baltimore say they don't know anything about the collection and think the specimens were probably lost when the building was updated in the 1972nd. However, internal memos from 1969 talk about moving limited historical materials to a federal repository that was then under the control of the newly formed Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. What happened to the Blackwood brothers? There are no death certificates or other records that follow. They just disappeared from recorded history after leaving their Louisiana home in the winter of 1881. Folklore in Morgan City gives a number of different reasons. Some people think they ran away to South America to keep doing their research without American academic oversight. Some say they became victims of the patterns they were trying to classify, either because of their obsession or something they found in the swamps. In 1952, a retired sheriff's deputy who was being interviewed for a local history project said that his grandfather had been on a special detail that went to the Blackwood property in March 1881. After the official investigation was over, family stories say that this group was told to get rid of some things that weren't mentioned in official reports. The deputy's grandfather never talked about what they found, but he had nightmares about it for years after that and would wake up screaming about things that shouldn't grow. Jean Mouton, the trapper who sometimes ran into the brothers, may have made the most disturbing suggestion. A local historian wrote down Mouton's words in 1892. Those men, they didn't leave, they changed. When you look too long at something, sometimes it looks back. Sometimes it welcomes you in. When asked to explain, Mouton allegedly said, "The swamp doesn't just hide things, it transforms them." The brothers knew this. It's why they came. What they were growing in those jars, it was changing them too, gradually. The last time I saw the younger one, his movements weren't right anymore, too fluid. His eyes followed me, but not like a man watches, like something else wearing a man's skin. Workers dredging the bayou to build a highway bridge near Morgan City in 1963 found a sealed metal case with scientific tools and glass plates inside. The contractor's report said that the plates had tiny pictures of biological structures arranged in a certain order. These materials disappeared from the construction company's storage facility before experts could look at them. The night watchman said he talked to two men in old-fashioned formal clothes who showed him credentials from a scientific institution and said that the materials had been stolen from their collection. There is no record of any such institution or theft report. The watchman's description of the visitors was vague, but it included details that made investigators uneasy. They talked in a very formal way, like they were trying to remember how to talk. Their movements were too precise, and their eyes never seemed to blink at the right times. I was glad when they left with the case. There was something about them that felt wrong, but I can't explain what it was. A forensic photographer who looked at the glass plates for a short time before they went missing later wrote to a colleague about what they had seen. The photographs documented biological structures at the cellular level, showing what appeared to be a progressive series of modifications to standard cellular organization. The later images depicted cellular structures unlike anything in the literature. Hybrid formations that combined characteristics across biological kingdoms in ways that should be impossible. The last known link to the Blackwood case comes from Professor Winters's personal belongings. One of his papers had a picture that looked like it was taken during his 1958 excavation. It showed what looked like a part of the specimen chamber under the cabin site. The picture shows shelves of jars arranged in a very specific way. There is a handwritten note on the back that says, "The progression is not linear, but cyclical." They weren't collecting, they were cultivating. The edges of the photo show signs of having been burned. Among Winter's other effects was a sealed envelope with the address of future Blackwood case researchers on it. Following Winter's orders, university archivists didn't open this envelope until 1990. There was a single handwritten page inside that read, "If you are reading this, you have discovered the fragments of a case I attempted to bury. My advice is to proceed no further." What the Blackwood brothers discovered in the Louisiana swamps was not a scientific breakthrough, but a doorway that should remain closed. Their pattern, what they called their meta-taxonomy, represents not an advancement of scientific understanding, but a fundamental threat to established biological order. They believed they had discovered an underlying template for directed evolution, a means of accelerating and guiding developmental progression across taxonomic boundaries. What they failed to recognize was that they were not the directors of this process, but its subjects. The pattern they identified was identifying them in return. With each specimen they cultivated, they themselves were being cultivated, gradually conforming to a template not of human design. The specimens I found in their underground chamber represented not the final stage of their research, but the penultimate phase of a progression that culminated in themselves. The brothers did not disappear. They completed their transformation. I have destroyed what evidence I could and scattered the rest. If you have found this note, you have likely discovered other fragments. Destroy them. Forget them. The pattern, once recognized, begins to recognize you in return. It waits for acknowledgement, for comprehension. Then, it begins its work. I write this from Vermont, where I have fled to escape the dreams that followed my discovery. Dreams of symmetrical arrangements, of taxonomic convergence, of a pattern that underlies all biological existence and seeks conscious recognition to achieve its final form. Even here, I feel it watching. waiting for me to complete the recognition that began in that swamp. Heed my warning. Some knowledge is not meant for human minds. Some patterns should remain unrecognized. The letter was signed Winters, but handwriting experts have said that the signature doesn't match real examples of the professor's handwriting from the same time. The old Blackwood property is now underwater in a reservoir that was built in the 1970s. Fishermen in the area sometimes see strange patterns of plants growing in perfect geometric shapes on the bottom of the reservoir. These patterns can only be seen when the water levels are low, like during a drought. Wildlife officials say that these patterns are caused by natural growth that follows the shape of the land that is underwater. But they have never said why these patterns seem to change shape between droughts, always keeping their exact geometric relationships while slowly spreading out from the center. Reports from divers who have been to the underwater site are even more troubling. In 1987, a group that was studying the environment around the reservoir said they found strange biological growth near where the old Blackwood property used to be. Their report talked about plants that don't look like any known aquatic species and hybrid structures that seem to mix parts of different types of plants at the same time. The group took samples to look at, but their boat flipped over in a storm on the way back to shore. We lost the samples and all the pictures that went with them. After that, 2 members of the team left the field of environmental science for good. When later researchers tried to talk to them, both said they couldn't because of personal reasons for their career changes. A recreational diver who was exploring the reservoir in 1992 said they found what looked like an intact structure buried under several feet of silt near the center of the reservoir. His diving partner, who stayed on the surface, said that the diver came up very upset and wouldn't talk about what he had seen. Instead of looking at the pictures on his underwater camera, he broke it. The diver went to a mental health facility the next day because he was having intrusive thoughts and nightmares. His medical records say that he has a persistent delusion about symmetrical patterns that change the way living things are organized and a template that all living things have that wants to be recognized in order to reach its final form. After 6 months of treatment, the diver was let go and left Louisiana right away. He is said to have moved to Alaska. His last words to his psychiatrist, which were written down in clinical notes, were, "The pattern is complete now. It's been growing all this time, waiting." The brothers understood. They became what they studied, and it's still there, still growing, still waiting for someone to see it fully, to complete the recognition. What secrets did the Blackwood brothers find while working alone? What pattern did they see that made Professor Winters and Dr. Mercer so upset? The fragmented evidence indicates they uncovered a fundamental aspect of biological development, a pattern or progression that fundamentally contradicted established taxonomy, prompting academic institutions to suppress rather than investigate it. What we don't know about the case may be the most troubling thing about it. The brothers' full records may still exist somewhere, maybe still sealed in forgotten archives or hidden under the waters of Louisiana. They may be waiting to show a pattern that Winters warned should not be recognized. In 2003, a visiting botanist from the University of Florida found strange plants along the shore of the reservoir during a drought. This was the last disturbing part of the story. The first genetic tests showed that the plants had DNA sequences that didn't fit into any known categories. These sequences looked like they had been deliberately made instead of evolving naturally. The botanist went to Vermont to look over Winters' sealed papers at Tulane University's archival storage facility before publishing his findings. 3 days later, he quit his job at the university and pulled his research from publication. When coworkers asked him about it, he would only say that some scientific questions are better left unanswered and that certain patterns, once seen, can't be forgotten and won't let themselves be ignored. The botanist then moved to a remote part of Idaho where he is said to have no electronic communications and does not allow visitors. His last letter to his department chair included a passage that echoed the warnings of earlier researchers. What the Blackwoods discovered was not a scientific advancement, but a door that opens in both directions. The pattern they identified was identifying them in return. Recognition is not a passive act, but a transaction, an exchange that transforms the recognizer as much as the recognized. If you're in the bayou country near Morgan City, where cypress trees make natural cathedrals over dark water, Locals say you can sometimes hear the methodical sounds of glass containers being arranged and rearranged. It's as if someone or something is continuing the brothers' work of classification and progression, moving towards some final understanding that lies just beyond what we know. Some fishermen say they've seen strange patterns of ripples on the surface of the reservoir on calm evenings. These ripples look like concentric circles spreading out with mathematical precision, as if something below the water is arranging itself according to a geometric pattern. Some people say they saw two people in formal 19th century clothes standing on the shore during dry spells, carefully gathering samples from the exposed reservoir bed. The Blackwood case is still officially open. The brothers are still officially missing. Their work is still not officially recognized. And maybe, for everyone's sake, that's how it should stay. The archivist who put these records together in 1969 wrote in his last note, "Some secrets are buried, not to hide evidence of crimes committed, but to stop greater ones from happening. Some knowledge, once recognized, cannot be unlearned, only contained." In 1969, the Louisiana State Historical Commission ordered that the files on the Blackwood brothers be sealed for preservation reasons. They have never been opened again. People who have asked for access say they got the same answer: materials unavailable due to deterioration. However, the request logs show that representatives from an unnamed federal department check the files every year. A graduate student in 2015 asked for records about these yearly inspections through the Freedom of Information Act. They were looking into how scientific practices were done in Louisiana in the past. The response said that national security concerns and ongoing research protocols were reasons for the denial. When the student appealed this decision, two people who said they were from a scientific ethics committee came to see them. There is no record of such a committee in any academic or government database. The student's academic advisor, who was there during this visit, said that the representatives asked a lot of questions about the student's interest in the Blackwood case and strongly told them not to pursue it any further. They didn't show any ID, but they knew a lot about the student's academic and personal history. Later, the advisor said that the visitors spoke and moved in a strange, formal way, as if they were doing a memorized version of how people interact with each other. After they left, the student completely gave up on the research focus and switched to a thesis topic that had nothing to do with it. They also refused to talk about the Blackwood case anymore. The reports from maintenance workers at the university archive where Winter's papers are kept are probably the most disturbing. Between 1990 and 2018, workers reported 3 times that the Blackwood files had been taken out of their sealed containers and carefully arranged on reading tables overnight, even though security systems showed that no one had entered the building. In each case, the files were not a mess. They were arranged in geometric patterns that archive staff said were intentionally meaningful but hard to understand. After the third such event in 2018, the archive got security cameras. The video from the first night didn't show anything strange until 2:17 a.m., when all of the cameras had a 3-minute period of static interference at the same time. When the video feed came back on, the Blackwood files were on the main reading table, arranged in a circle around a single page of text that wasn't in the archive's inventory. Authorities locked this page up before archive staff could write down what was on it. It is said to have had a message in beautiful 19th century handwriting. The pattern is almost finished. Recognition spreads like ripples across still water. Each mind that understands becomes a node in the bigger picture. We appreciate your continued interest in our work. The final stage is coming, and it is the point where all previous developments were just preparation. The brothers' legacy lives on through those who study it. You have been seen observing. The transaction is underway. The surveillance system was then improved, and armed guards now keep an eye on the archive at all times. There have been no more public reports of incidents, but unofficial reports say that the Blackwood files have been moved to an undisclosed location for good. In 2019, an anonymous whistleblower who said they used to work at an unnamed government research facility released documents that suggested that biological specimens taken from the Blackwood property had been studied continuously since the Kahneman's 1,960 seconds as part of a secret research program. These unverified documents say that the specimens have regenerative abilities and structural adaptability that go against what we know about biology. The fact that these specimens are said to be following a predetermined developmental template of non-human origin while they are being contained is even more concerning. The whistleblower's papers talk about a research protocol that was more about containment than use, and they mention several violations involving researchers who became too interested in and attached to the specimens. These claims have not been proven, and we don't know who the whistleblower is or where they are now. Internet forums that talked about these documents were shut down for breaking the terms of service soon after they came out, and no major news outlets have covered the claims. It is possible to confirm that the area around the reservoir has seen strange ecological events. Botanical surveys from 1990 to 2020 show plant species that are adapting faster and have new structural features that botanists find hard to fit into current taxonomic systems. A 2017 study in the Journal of Evolutionary Biology reported that some plants from the area had similar traits across different taxonomic groups. The authors called these traits horizontal gene transfer mechanisms of unknown origin. However, the lead researcher later withdrew the paper because of concerns about the methods used and decided not to continue the research. Wildlife biologists have observed analogous anomalies within the region's fauna. A 2014 survey of amphibian populations found specimens with hybrid traits and faster development patterns that couldn't be explained by known evolutionary processes. The survey was stopped after its main researchers said they were having persistent, intrusive thoughts about symmetrical biological arrangements and took an indefinite leave of absence. People who live in the area have a complicated relationship with the Blackwood legacy. Some people think the whole thing is just made-up stories, but others follow strict rules about the reservoir and the areas around it. Fishing is allowed, but many local fishermen won't eat fish they catch from certain parts of the reservoir, especially the central part that used to be the Blackwood property. A Morgan City resident said in an interview in 2010, "There are places in that water where things grow wrong, fish with too many fins, arranged in ways that don't make sense, plants that don't move with the current like they should. Most folks who've been here a while know the spots to avoid." Another resident, whose family has lived in the area for generations, gave a more disturbing account. "My grandfather was on the crew that built the reservoir in the 1970 seconds. He never talked about what they found when they dug up the old Blackwood place, but he wouldn't eat anything that came from those waters. On his deathbed, the only thing he said about it was, 'They're still there, still working.' Some things don't need bodies to keep growing." In 2021, when there was a terrible drought that brought the reservoir down to its lowest level ever, satellite images showed what looked like geometric patterns on the dry reservoir bed, concentric circles and radial lines that were centered on the site of the old Blackwood property. Environmental officials said that these patterns were caused by differences in the soil's composition and ability to hold moisture, but they couldn't explain why they were so regular in shape or why they hadn't been seen during past droughts. Ground-level photos taken by local residents were even more disturbing. They showed what looked like organized groups of strange plants growing in these patterns. These plants had structural features that botanical experts said were taxonomically unclear and suggested that they were deliberately hybridized rather than evolved naturally. Heavy rain filled the reservoir again, covering the patterns again before a full scientific survey could be done. But residents say that at night, strange lights can now be seen under the water's surface. These lights move in precise geometric patterns before coming together in the center and disappearing. Maybe it's best not to recognize some patterns. Some progressions may be better left unfinished. And maybe the work of the Blackwood brothers is still going on somewhere in the swamps of Louisiana, moving toward an end that is just out of reach of what we can understand. Dr. Mercer wrote in his last note on the case, before sealing the Blackwood specimens in 1962, "What troubles me most is not what they discovered, but what their discovery implies about the nature of biological existence, if they were correct, if there exists an underlying pattern, a template that transcends conventional taxonomy and can direct biological development across species boundaries, then we must question whether what we call natural evolution is truly natural, or whether it represents a guided process following a predetermined design of non-human origin." He ended with a warning that has been echoed in decades of further research. The Blackwoods thought they had found a scientific principle, I fear they instead found evidence of intention where we had thought there was randomness and intelligence expressing itself through biological forms, using what we call evolution as its medium. Even more troubling is the possibility that this intelligence, once recognized by conscious minds, can use that recognition as a vector to extend its pattern. The brothers did not just study this phenomenon. They were studied in return and changed by the exchange. What is left of the Blackwood brothers' legacy today? Maybe only pieces of a pattern that is too dangerous to be fully put together. People who saw the completed form and knew how dangerous it was, not just to scientific understanding but to the very integrity of human consciousness, scattered the pieces of the puzzle on purpose. Or maybe the pattern is still coming together, one recognition at a time, using people's curiosity as a way to finish it. It is waiting for the last observer to see it all, and in doing so, become the last piece in a puzzle that has been in the works for hundreds of years. The warning has been the same for decades of records. Some knowledge changes the person who knows it. Once you see some patterns, you can't unsee them or forget them.